Everyone, or good morning if you're out in Oconus land. This is the VLab forum for the month of April, and this is Steve Smith, director of the VLab, and I'm joined here in the VLab forum studios in beautiful downtown Silver Spring in the shadow of the giant acorn by Dr. John Chattel, our logistics manager. And we're very fortunate today for our April edition to have Dr. John Hoeve of the Weather Service Office of Organizational Excellence, who's going to give us a talk today on the cultural implications of evolving the National Weather Service to provide impact-based decision support services. His collaborators in the OOE, as it's known, are Julie Wagner, Megan Fox, Jeff Jeffress, Elise Hagner, and Peyton Robertson, who is the director. John is the deputy director of this office. Reminder, our format for the VLab forums is about 30 minutes of content and followed by about 30 minutes or so of question and answer. We ask that unless it's an urgent clarifying question, that you wait for the Q&A to ask a question. And when we get to that point, please use the raise your hand feature of the GoToWebinar. John Chattel will unmute you so you can ask a question directly to John Hoeve, or you can use the chat feature as well. Further, this is a reminder that these sessions are recorded, and we will upload the recording of today's session to the VLab forum website shortly after the conclusion of today's session, so you can share it with your colleagues, friends, relatives, whoever. So we are continuing to try to diversify some of these topics. The VLab forum is focused on research to operations nominally, but and Weather Service mission is evolving to do more in the way of so-called IDSS, impact-based decision support services. And so we want to have more presentations along these lines, including things that deal with social science aspects of this particular mission. So today, John's going to talk about culture. And without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Hoeve.
Thanks, Steve. First, I want to thank you for inviting me. I know you're also a champion of organizational health and culture, so I appreciate that. So I gave this talk at AMS, and a lot of people thought I was a social scientist, but I'm not. I'm a physical scientist, but have recently got interested more in strategy and organizational change, and culture is a big part of that. So hopefully this talk is interesting to not only folks in the Weather Service that are dealing with IDSS, but I think it's broad enough to apply to kind of everyone at NOAA as well. So, gotta click on it. There we go. There we go. So, first, a little bit about our office. Many people hear Office of Organizational Excellence and they think, what the heck is that? It's not really very descriptive. What we do is we try to apply strategic thinking across the Weather Service. We try to challenge the status quo, enable change, and create enterprise and internal connections. So we're a staff office in Weather Service headquarters. And the four focus areas that we have are strategy, organizational health and culture, which we'll talk about today, external engagement, which is creating partnerships with a lot of the folks in the private sector, and also governance. And I want to introduce Elise Hagner, who's here with me. She's the organizational health and culture lead, new to OOE, and well, relatively new, 2 months or so, and we're happy to have her. And she'll be taking this organizational health and culture work and moving it forward. So, for those of you who are new to organizational culture, which might be many of you, there's a lot of different definitions out there. On the left here is the definition we use. It's the behaviors, habits, values, and norms which are reflected in our workplace environment and our attitudes or feelings about work. In short, really everything from day-to-day performance to trying to strategically change an organization is dependent on organizational culture. And there's a growing base of evidence that supports that. This is just one piece of evidence that I pulled from a McKinsey study in 2017, asking 2,000 global executives what is the biggest barrier to effectiveness in the digital age, and by far many of them replied with cultural and behavioral challenges within their organization. So it is real, and it's something that I think is growing in importance. How do we know it's important to the Weather Service? Well, I'll show a chart here for our own Stephen Smith. He presented this, I think, a few times. This is from the 2017 annual NWA meeting. And he looked at culture. He ranked offices in the Weather Service on a culture index, and then looked at the top 1/3 of WFOs on this culture index, and also the bottom 1/3 of WFOs. And he looked at those Tornado Critical Success Index. And he looked over several years and found that there was a discernible difference between those offices that had a higher culture score versus the ones that had a lower culture score. And you know, you might think that this is odd that culture is having a direct impact, or I should say that, you know, correlation doesn't imply causation. So you know, these are just trends, but it does seem that there is some sort of direct or indirect impact that culture is having on the core operational services that we're providing. So this, I think, we've used this a lot in our talks, because it really hits home for a lot of our folks in the Weather Service that, hey, this actually does matter to something that I care about day to day. As good scientists, we try to get a better quantitative understanding of our culture. So we looked across a variety of surveys that we've done. You're probably familiar with the VLab survey. That's an annual survey that hits, you know, a subset of employees every year. But you know, we have data every year on that. We did 2 deeper dives into what we're calling an organizational health index, or it was actually McKinsey helped us do that. It was in 2015 and 2017. It gave us a lot of data on how culture impacts performance, and we had, you know, 2,000 responses for each one of the surveys. So about half of the folks in the Weather Service replied to that. And then we also looked at the organizational culture index. We did that more as a test. We looked at just a few offices and headquarters in Southern region. And each one of these surveys is a bit different. They have different strengths and weaknesses. You know, the FEV survey is more about employee satisfaction, whereas the OHI is more about performance and how culture impacts performance. And then the OCI is more about kind of what kind of culture, more descriptive version of what our culture is now and what the ideal culture is for the Weather Service going forward. So based on all this information, we try to develop some themes on kind of good and bad, or, you know, good and bad aspects of our culture, I would say. Although, again, another disclaimer that, you know, there's really not one culture in the Weather Service. We have our OHI data is down to each office, and there's really a wide spread of results that we've been getting based on the office. So these, again, are kind of more general trends. So some of the strengths that we've observed in the surveys, we have a workforce that's very highly motivated. This probably is not a shock to many of you. They're very mission oriented. They take a lot of pride in providing forecasts and warnings for the protection of life and property. In fact, there was a recent book, have you heard of Mission Mystique? It was, you know, Dr. Julian has been talking about it in a few of his recent speeches. And it was written in 2011 and looked at 6 different case studies across state and federal government with agencies that have really strong missions, that have a strong sense of purpose and have a kind of very rich culture and motivation. And one of those organizations was the National Weather Service. So there's kind of a recognition out there that people in the Weather Service, they really care about what they do. And I think this combats a little bit of the perception sometimes people have that people in the Weather Service are just doing science for science sake, and that's often not the case. I mean, anecdotally, to many of the forecasters I've talked to, it's really about the mission. It's about, you know, the end result of protecting lives and property. I mean, sure, there's some folks out there that are really interested in the science, but there is that real strong connection to the mission. If you look the third down, customer focused, we're very customer focused. 72% of staff feel the organization is good at managing constituent and stakeholder networks. And I think that relates back to the mission orientation, because we know that in order to accomplish our mission of saving lives and property, we need to do that through partners, either it's emergency management or water resource management, or the media or communities or the public. So that kind of outreach function is very important. We also have very high levels of job satisfaction and also strong supervisor-employee relationships, where almost 70% of staff say they trust their immediate supervisor. So some of the weaknesses that we've observed in the surveys are trust and employee engagement, that could be improved, that 30% of employees feel that leadership doesn't ask for opinions regarding big decisions, and that's mostly senior leadership, I think, they're reporting there. Also, people are desiring of a more humanistic and encouraging environment. This came out of our OCI data. So what we found is that a lot of our employees that we survey thought that we have more of a kind of a passive and defensive culture, and some aspects of those are kind of trying to shy away from problems, laying low when things get tough, kind of fighting ideas or new ideas in the organization. So people reported wanting to have a more humanistic and encouraging environment, which I think is true. Role clarity, 40% of staff report that job design and organizational structures currently muddy roles and responsibilities. And then there's accountability and recognition, which is low across the federal government overall, but is an area I think that a focus that we should look into, and we'll talk about that more. And then innovation and learning, with only 15% of staff saying that we regularly adopt external best practices. Again, those are some of our growth areas. So what are we trying to do here? So we just, I would say, started on our culture journey. This is really spearheaded by a previous director at OOE, Kevin Warner, who was very interested in organizational health and culture, and then got other people interested in it as well. So I would say that we're along the way of understanding our culture, or we have a little bit of ways to go, but we have a pretty good sense of what our culture is here. I think the next real step is to operationalize it. And so what it says here is, how do we equip employees to apply the culture in their day-to-day work? So we tried something last year, which is a little bit different. Instead of having kind of the typical headquarters top-down initiative, we tried doing something that was a little more bottom-up. And we stood up a culture team. We used the NRAP, the NOAA Rotational Assignment Program. We asked for folks, particularly out in the field, who's interested in health and culture, and who would be willing to contribute kind of a 10% remote detail to this effort. And we also luckily we got Julie Wagner, who's there on the right. She's from OMAO, and she did a 80% detail with us in headquarters. So she came here and coordinated the team. And so you can see where the folks are from. We have pretty good representation from across the different regions. We also have different levels, from interns up to WCMs. So what we did was, instead of starting with the surveys, we started with just simple kind of questions of, what does organizational culture mean to you? We asked them to observe and analyze and experiment in their own lives, and try to kind of create a more meaningful definition of culture for themselves. And then we asked them to take action in their offices. And so what actually happened was pretty interesting. The things that they came up with, the action plans, the ideas that they came up with, were really targeting those same initiatives or the growth areas, I should say, from the surveys, right? And so here's some examples of what the team has been working on. So one of our team members, reported that one of the new MICs in their office delivers kind of on-the-spot swag awards for attention to the mission. So one forecaster got an award for proactively reaching out to firefighters during a large hazardous materials fire to update them on changing wind conditions. So, right, this is IDSS, right? This is the essence of IDSS. But as you know, in many of our forecast offices, there's not too much cash to go around for awards. And so, people are coming up with innovative ways to still recognize people that are doing the mission, that are trying to push the mission forward. So that's how, so that's the best practice that we've now cataloged, and we'll talk about a little bit kind of what we're doing with all these best practices. Another example here is in trust and employee engagement. So this one said, our office did an internal review of our services and our messaging in a staff meeting, and it discussed ways we can improve for the next event. I think most of the staff learned ways to ramp up our messaging to the public and our partners in case an event like that occurs again. So I know a lot of offices do post-event reviews. Not all of them do that. So this is another example of just an office that helped improve employee engagement by going through these post-event reviews, and then everyone kind of felt a little bit more empowered to make changes in their own lives and then change in their own workflow in order to improve for the next time. And the last one I'll highlight here, this is an action that, again, one of our NRAP culture team members took. They said, in our office, people don't often talk about their forecasts. This is a more junior member of the Weather Service. and they said, I explained to my colleagues the benefit of hearing their thought process and from sharing mine. Now I find other people who feel the same way, which is satisfying and improves our forecast. Right, so there's just a little change in an office, found a group of people who are more willing to talk about their forecast and help essentially mentor this more junior employee. And I think this person's also learning from the experience. So again, these are small changes, I know, and it's not a huge scope, right? This isn't like a huge headquarters initiative, but it's real changes, right? Or real things that are making a difference, and I think that's kind of cool. What are we trying to do to spread the word? So one of a subgroup of that culture team started a knowledge base or a portal. We're still working on it. It's not public yet, but we're trying to figure out ways to take these best practices and essentially share them even more broadly. What the team is doing now, we have a few people who are still in the team, and actually we're starting up a new team, and it's out because the NRAP announcement is out right now. So we're doing another team. Elise will be running that team, and kind of picking up where the last team left off. But what the team's doing is doing more peer-to-peer information sharing right now. So they're going out and asking other offices, what are your best practices based on our OHI data and knowing which offices do well in certain areas. So it's less obtrusive. It's not like, again, headquarters is asking an office to report on something, which gets people a little bit nervous, understandably, right? So this is, again, more peer-to-peer. I think it's been very successful. We now have this group of best practices, and we're still trying to figure out, how to disseminate them. And I know that maybe VLab can play a role in that going forward. So one other thing that we're trying to do in OOE now is what we're calling a little bit more tailored culture consulting. So we've done this to one office, and we have a couple more scheduled. For offices that are interested in their own scores, right, we have them, and what we do is we try to provide some tailored support. So we try to identify strengths and weaknesses of a certain office, and then strategies for improvement based on, again, these best practices. And we're not just trying to look at the lowest score, right, and improve the lowest score, because that's not always what the best strategy is. Sometimes it's taking a score that is pretty high in the Weather Service, but lower in a certain area, knowing that kind of there's probably more room for growth than an area like, there's a low FEV score that we get every year, which is that, employees with good performance results get promoted, something like that, right? And it's like, that's very hard to change in our federal system, so we're not going to try to go after that. But other areas we could try to go after. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about culture in terms of change. So before this whole, I would say the presentation up to now is talking about culture in terms of just day-to-day improvement in your office and day-to-day improvement in performance. Now I want to shift a little bit, and this is probably a little bit more provocative part of the talk on culture as it relates to evolving the Weather Service. And this is a quote from our director, and I think it's true. It's evolving the Weather Service is a cultural change, right? And I'm glad that he's paying attention to this, because more research is coming out that culture used to be kind of an HR function, and now it's becoming a front office function. It's people are realizing that it's really important for organizational change, and I'm glad that Louis is kind of bought onto this, because I know we're definitely supportive of it. So to get a sense of what's happening today, I think it's helpful to look at the last big change to the forecast process, right? This is when we went from zone forecast, from typing zone forecast to gridded forecast at much higher resolution. And I read the book. I don't know if you guys read The Office of the Storm. I know Tim has read it. And the book quoted some meteorologists of the time, and this is a quote that stood out to me, which said, right now we own our own products because it's our words. It won't be our words with the new system. And they're talking about the new, digital forecast database. And so, there was a culture change that went on at that time. And the way I saw it was that there were some cultural impacts that the forecasters were losing literary autonomy over their forecasts, because, before they were able to type in exactly what the impact was, put it into context, that was no longer the case, right? The text was going to be generated from the digital forecast. But on the positive side, they're gaining greater meteorological detail by incorporating new science and technologies. And so from people that went through this, the modernization, or this is kind of the tail end of the modernization, people said that, a lot of people left. People didn't want to go through the change, they retired. But there was also a whole new generation of people that came in that, had bachelor's and master's in meteorology, and they're really psyched by this stuff, right? They're really psyched by the new science technology that we're putting forward. So there was a cultural impact then, and so I would say there's another cultural impact now of what we're trying to go to. So now the challenge, I would say, is this is probably completely oversimplified too, by the way, right? Because there's a lot more that's in the forecast process besides just what I'm showing. But where we're trying to go to is from this digital forecast to more collaborative forecast, which is enabled by things like the National Blend of Models, which allows forecasters to focus a little bit more on kind of interpretation, consultation, communication of forecasts, and their impacts through IDSS, right? And so the future might be more about evaluating models, forecasting more local effects that can't be picked up by the models, and putting these events into context based on previous events or other descriptions of impact. So what's kind of the cultural implications of this type of change? Well, I think on a positive, we're gaining back the literary autonomy, right, through IDSS, right? We're back to the words, or we're able to say, this storm is going to be worse than the storm last week, and it's going to be, but not quite as bad as the storm 2 months ago, right? And I think people understand that there's a greater ability to save lives and property through IDSS, right? So our mission statement, which Louis likes to say, is the provision of forecasts and warnings for the protection of life and property, and that for the protection of life and property, IDSS gets us a lot further along the way than if we didn't do IDSS. And so, I would hypothesize that these things align with some of the positive aspects of our culture, right? So some people think that IDSS isn't in our DNA or in our culture. I would argue against that, right? And I think we've seen that is that people in our forecast offices, they want to be able to save lives and property. They want to be able to do our mission, as we showed before. And if we can show them that doing IDSS is going to improve our ability to do our mission, well then, I think they'll be very supportive. On the flip side, though, you can see some negative aspects. There's definitely a fear of losing autonomy over the forecast, and that could be autonomy to a model, or it could be autonomy to someone else in this collaborative forecast process that really hasn't been quite defined yet. And then there's a fear of losing the meteorological acumen, right? I've heard several times, like, we're just going to be plugging in the blend. We're not going to really understand the meteorology behind it. We're not going to understand how the blend really works. We're not going to really understand the analyses that verify the blend and how those work and what the pros and cons of those, right? So you hear a lot of those, types of statements. And so, I think related to these areas are some of the weaknesses we observed before, right? Role clarity, when people said, I'm not really sure exactly what my job is relative to someone else. Well, that's part of this autonomy issue. And then, of course, innovation and learning, and making sure that, that we're staying on the cutting edge, right? And our forecasters are staying on the cutting edge. So, this is not, this next slide is not the official kind of Weather Service action plan. This is the John Tenhove's thought on what the action plan could be. But I think that there's definitely ways to overcome these barriers, right? It's not all hope is lost. So, the first thing I think is valuing and rewarding what matters. So we have to do a better job of aligning our performance measures, our reward systems, and hiring with the new strategies, including IDSS. I remember going to a forecast office, and I was there during one of the public days, right, where like the public is in, and one of the members of the public, it was a mom, said, how do you know if your guys are doing a good job? And the forecaster kind of thought for a second, said, well, we have all these different measures, right? We have lead time, and we have first alarm rate, and all this. Didn't talk at all about, outcomes. Didn't talk about, what I call customer experience, but didn't talk about does the emergency management think we're doing a good job, and are we supporting the decisions they need, or are behaviors changing on their part because of the services we're providing, right? These are things we're not really getting at yet, and are things that we need to develop.
But I mean, there's also an assumption that they're attuned to that. I mean, we think that they are, right? I mean,
well, I guess maybe they are, but not on paper, right?
Okay.
Because on paper we don't have, right? When we're looking at our performance measures every year, we don't like put up our GitRes and then we put up our like customer experience and like look at both, right? It's still mostly on the operational side.
Yeah.
So it's just like a kind of a gradual shift that we might need to make, and then continuing to show examples. I think Weather Service has been doing a great job at this, but continuing to show examples that show how IDSS allows Weather Service to realize its mission, right? Because that's going to really, push forward this activity. The next thing here is continue innovation learning and maintaining expertise, ensuring that Weather Service builds and adopts state-of-the-art science and technology. I think that's important to a lot of our workforce. And then ensuring the future operational workflow, whatever that is, continues to maintain situational awareness, forecaster expertise, and ability to add local skill when it matters most. And this is kind of probably an interesting discussion if you want to get into this later, especially with this group, is how do you really do that, right? How do you maintain those things when there's a lot of data coming out the forecaster, right? More and more and more, and so you use really innovative tools to be able to post-process all the data, but now models are being run every couple hours, and how is that idea of like the forecast package really changing? And I know there's been a lot of discussions about those things, but making sure that the forecasters feel like they're being able to be a part of that process, I think is important. And then finally, here is role clarity. So, I mean, something we probably need to do is to define the roles and responsibilities of the future forecast process. And so, uncertainty, I think, in a lot of cases is worse than the actual change. And I think there's still just a lot of uncertainty around this. And, I think it's common for any employee to want to see where they're having a tangible impact on their work, right? And so right now it's a little bit opaque of what different roles are being doing. And so I think, right now, I think it is the case, right? In a lot of the forecast products, forecasters sign their name, right, to the product. And so it's like, I did this product, I submitted it, like I did a good day's work, I contributed to the Weather Service today. And in this new collaborative forecast process we're talking about, it's a little bit more nebulous. It's like, okay, am I communicating someone else's product? Am I adding value to a certain product that someone else, so, and that just, raises a little bit of tensions, right? The last thing I'll mention on this slide is that there's a book by Daniel Pink called Drive, which gets at what really motivates employees. And of course, there's some base level of compensation you need, right, to bring people to work. But beyond that, it's a few things. And he says it's purpose, mastery, and autonomy are the real things that really drive employees. And when I looked at these areas or activities, they kind of align a bit with those areas, right? It's purpose in terms of what are you valuing, mastery in terms of making sure that you maintain your skill level and you can say like I'm an expert at what I do, and then autonomy in that I actually have a direct impact in the products of the National Weather Service, right? What I do makes a difference is what people want to say. So, unsurprisingly, we're focusing on some of those areas in OOE, right? This is relatively new, but we picked out 4 areas that we want to really hone in on, and that's trust, innovation, role clarity, and recognition. And we're still figuring out how to do this. We might even pick off 1 per year to really focus it, but those are the areas that we're going to try to focus on in OOE and try to get broader buy-in as well. And to that effect, we started this. Not us, we didn't start it, but a group started this people team. We need a better name than people team, but right now it's called the people team, and you can see who's on it. It's like, and we just met this morning too. It's our chief learning officer, us, OE, communications, diversity and inclusion, human resources, and labor management, right? Because there's a lot of activities that are going on. All of us support employees in some way. We're all in the front office, right? We all have kind of similar goal, but we're all operating a little bit differently. So we thought it'd be best to come together and see if we could try to tackle some of these big thorny issues as a group. So that's just starting, and we'll see where it goes. And so I think this is my last, this is my last slide. So, we kind of brainstormed a little bit on the culture team of like kind of what can the future look like. And I think if we do make some of these cultural changes, this is kind of a result that might occur, right? We might have a more human-centered, customer-centered approach to forecasting, right? Instead of providing the information that we think our partners need, we'll actually provide the information that they need, right? So we're going to have a better understanding of really their needs, and then be a little bit more tailored to them. And again, these are the emergency management, the deep, what are they called, deep core partners or deep relationship partners. I think we'll also change a little bit about how forecasters value themselves, so that we're still maintaining value in terms of an accurate forecast, but also that result in positive societal business outcomes. And it's I think this is true. As an aside, when I gave this talk at AMS, right before me was AccuWeather. Marshall Moss from AccuWeather was giving a talk, and it was almost, different words, but essentially the same concept, right? These aren't changes that are just happening in the Weather Service. These are happening across the whole enterprise, right? And everyone's kind of struggling with how to do it and how do we prepare the next generation of forecasters kind of for these changes. And something also I think it would be interesting to talk about here is modeling, and I often see NDFD versus NBM graphs, and that just kills me personally, because it's like what I think we should be saying is like models are tools, right? They're tools to an end, which is an outcome. And it's like we're not trying to pit kind of a forecaster against a model, right? So we could kind of shift the whole paradigm around and say, this is what we're valuing. We're valuing accurate forecasts, which use a variety of tools to do that, plus these positive outcomes. And then finally, the recognition that forecasting really should become a little bit more of a team sport, right? It's not just my forecast, my office. That we could probably provide better forecasts overall if we're a little bit more collaborative. And that's, across not just, this is really radical, but not just across our weather service, but, even across the enterprise, right? Because, for those forecast offices that are really heavily on chat, the media loves it, and everyone's got kind of a similar message, assuming there's good relationships there between media and weather service, right? And what we've heard is it's more effective, right? If you're hearing the same message from multiple avenues and multiple channels, so that could be a long distant kind of future vision. So that's it. I just want to thank everyone that's helped with this work. Obviously not just me, and then for you guys for inviting me, and there's a couple of areas, a couple of questions I would have for you guys, but I should probably first open it up for questions you have.
All right, thanks, John. Very thought-provoking talk. So we're going to turn to our Q&A part of the forum today. So if you have a question for John, please use the raise your hand feature in the webinar, and John Chattel will unmute you, and you'll be able to ask that question directly to John. So let's see if we've got anybody yet. Does not appear. So, or you can use the chat feature. So let me start it off by asking. Gosh, I have so many questions. All right. So this one struck me on when you showed the overall sort of strengths and weaknesses in weather service based on the surveys, and it seemed like a disconnect between we're really good and strong supervisor-employer relationships, but there's a trust and an employee engagement where they don't feel leadership asks for opinions. So that seemed to be a little bit like two sides of a coin that I don't quite understand. I guess I've experienced both, but how do you reconcile that?
I think some of it is what tier of leadership and management you're looking at. That employees tend to trust their immediate supervisors, but maybe someone they're not having as much face time with or not communicating with on a daily basis. Honestly, probably not knowing personalities as much either. There's less trust at a higher level.
So you think it's more accounting for the amorphous leadership that we hate at headquarters versus my direct supervisor kind of thing. Okay.
That's definitely, yeah, a big component of it. And I think there's probably still improvements that could be made even at the local level in terms of engagement. So you might really have a strong relationship, or like, my supervisor like always comes back for me, or like, will pitch in when he needs to, and like, but might still not hold, meetings with staff to talk about new policies, for example. So, but I think the bigger one is what Elise said.
Okay. A follow-up to that is the demographics on this. So do you have access to the demographics on gender, race, traditional things? And have you looked at these responses stratified?
We don't have them for OHI. I don't think we asked those questions. They are for feds, right? They're in the,
okay.
But we haven't done that. We haven't stratified by. Do you think we'd find something interesting?
Well, I don't know. It's pure speculation, but Weather Service is still largely white male dominated kind of thing, and although it's changing, especially on gender. So I'd be curious it might be insightful to look into some of those, particularly the gender one. So let's see. All right. Questions in the room?
I have one for you, Steve. Earlier in one of the slides, there was a slide about the 1/3 top WFOs and the 1/3 bottom WFOs. You know the one?
Yeah, the tornado.
How did you determine the top and bottom? What criteria did you use? Did you talk to all of them, or what?
So this was done off of another survey back in 2002, which was the SFA, which was kind of an employee satisfaction survey. But basically, we did a correlation analysis, and we found that 3 questions on the SFA were highly correlated with tornado warning performance. So basically, we created a culture index based on the answers to those 3 questions, and we just took the offices which had the highest favorable rating for those 3 questions, and then the bottom third of the WFOs we considered in the survey, and that's basically what we found. So based on these 3 questions from the survey, we were able to capture that the offices that were responding more favorably had higher performance on tornado warning.
So what was the nature of these questions?
The questions, there was, I'd have to pull it out, but they had nothing to do with tornado warning. It was like, there was a question on performance reviews. There's a question that related to accessibility for people with disabilities. I forget what the third question, but it had absolutely no direct relationship to tornado.
It was morale? Or...
Yeah.
How do you know they just weren't better forecasters?
Well, we would have to, there's no way to measure better forecasters. So these were grouped by WFOs just purely based on their responses to these employee satisfaction questions. So you would not expect that this kind of result. You would expect it to be all over the place, basically. Do we have any questions from the audience? Go raise your hand.
I have a kind of a question for the audience, if they would indulge. So one of the areas that Elise is interested in, and like us, we're interested in too, is awards and recognition. And I'm just kind of curious if people think that the current awards and recognition program, right, between the ones that we have at Weather Service plus the typical NOAA ones that are out there, is that kind of sufficient, do you think, for the Weather Service, right? Because we continually hear it's not. But kind of curious of what the group thinks about that. I mean, should we spend some time kind of working with others to explore this further and see if it could be improved?
I'll chime in. I think absolutely. I think the awards and recognition system is, I won't say broken, but it's certainly antiquated and not very easily applied to recognizing things that stand outside of the traditional, and it's very political, highly political.
I would think it's almost like a pat on the back, because in terms of getting promotions and stuff, it just doesn't happen very often in the Weather Service, and it's more of who you know than what you know sometimes. And I think a lot of people recognize that and see that. So this is kind of a way of just quelling the folks, if you will, by just giving a pat on the back every so often. So it is kind of antiquated.
So did the OHI go to headquarters offices?
Mm-hmm.
It did. So
Yeah.
down to the branch level?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it's to that level. I'll have to double check. It might not be.
But it did go to the WFO level,
Yeah.
right? So one of the things that I'm struggling with is, because I'm, obviously I'm a champion of this, but is in my reading of where do you go is starting a conversation within a work group about culture, right? And then trying to kind of baseline it. And you have that for the OHI to some degree.
Yeah.
But it strikes me that there has to be, this conversation will not happen, in my opinion, unless it is directed to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So this gets to the accountability piece. And I know culture is not nowhere near the full responsibility of supervisors. But if they're not on board, then you're not going to make a lot of progress. And I suspect that it's hard to get them on board. So you may have to use a stick rather than a carrot to get these conversations to happen. So in the terms of, what to do next, it strikes me that there's got to be some sort of effort beyond just this is a nice to have kind of thing, so that supervisors in charge of employees are sort of held accountable for getting the discussion going. And back in the SFA days, we had facilitated feedback groups or sometimes non-facilitated feedback groups because these kind of conversations can be uncomfortable.
Right.
And there can be a lot of fear on the part of supervisors to have them, because they worry that it'll become a venting fest and it won't be productive, and et cetera, et cetera. So is there any discussion about doing that sort of thing?
Well, we just talked actually about that this morning, because right now it's all voluntary, right? So if managers come to us and say, we'd like your help, we'll provide their help, but it's not a mandated activity. But that is something we talked about this morning in our people team, is do we need more of a stick in some of these areas than a carrot, right? So I think that's still kind of to be determined, and it'd really be up to Mary as the executive champion of how much she wants to push on this type of work, right? And how much to make it mandatory.
Right. I mean, because I know people in past experiences with it say, well, put it in their performance plan. That does not mean they're accountable. I mean, you can put all kinds of, because basically you're only accountable to your direct supervisor in that regard, but making it mandatory that there should be some sort of annual conversation on culture, or how you describe it, but it needs to happen, and probably annual is the right frequency, at least initially, etc. But I think that's one observation.
I'm also kind of curious. Is any other reactions from people on the phone of something that I said that it's like, oh, I just don't agree with that, or just like that does not sound right at all?
So come on, all you on the phone.
I know they're being very quiet.
John's asking for some feedback, folks.
You're the introvert.
We have yes. Raise your hand, somebody. please.
What does the hazard sign mean?
They're not active, right?
They don't have enough on the screen.
Attentiveness, yeah, they're maybe doing other things, actually.
Oh,
That's
Listening in on them.
Is that what the triangle is?
Yes, these are intended, not attentive.
Right.
Now that we're talking about it, you feel the triangles go away.
But I think John, your assessment of comparing the previous cultural switch, the large one going from the text to the NDFD, essentially is that's right on. That's discussed in the authors of the Storm book. But then your speculation on where we are now, I also think that you've got it pretty well pegged. And it maps very nicely to the results of the survey stuff. So and you do hear this, but other than your talk, you don't hear. I mean, I hear lots of conversations about what IDSS means in weather service, but I don't hear this kind of discussion, especially when there's a fear about IDSS and actually we become. What happened to the meteorology is what I hear. I joined on the weather service because I love the weather and I love the science, and but I don't hear anybody saying, well, guess what? You're getting your autonomy back, and you can bring to bear your latent meteorological skills in providing, tactical IDSS.
Right.
So actually, this game is really right in your wheelhouse for those meteorological. So that kind of articulation of those, I guess, addressing the fears through those is something that we should continue to explore, and have both leadership, high level and middle level, start talking about it as well. So I hope I always forget if it's 2 O's or 2 E's. 2 E's? 2 O's. 2 O's. Could get that message out to higher management and middle level management in particular.
Yeah, and I should say that a lot of the activities that we were talking about here, we're doing some of them ourselves, but a lot of them are in partnership, right? So role clarity is PMO really related. So we're kind of trying to work with them to say, okay, how can we help you with this cultural issue, and where are we going? What are your plans with that? And so, but yeah, that's the goal, right? Is to try to, we're kind of influencers, we like to think, and make sure these conversations are happening at the right place, at the right times, and getting these talking points right into remarks when it's the right time. So that's what we're trying to do.
Sorry. I'm just wondering, the IDSS, the shift in culture, and Steve, you mentioned the idea of forecasting. That's one of the reasons I got into the business, but I didn't forecast it. I did development here at MDL. But there are plenty of folks that are scientists that are really not very good communicators, and they're more introverts. So how do you kind of overcome this? And maybe this is why there is some resistance. I don't know. I'm a sociologist, but it's almost like, if you're trying to enforce this, and it just really rubs against a lot of people because that really isn't their nature. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Everyone's going to have different talents, right? And so there's another kind of strategic discussion, which I think is one of the big strategic discussions for the Weather Service in the future, but we're not really having it yet. But again, our office is like looking forward, 10, 20 years. So we like to talk about all these big picture ideas, but
extroverts.
Yeah. So Brian Kearns piped in there. He can't use his mic, but he said it's higher extrovert. So yeah, Brian.
That's some of it, yeah.
But the question is. But the question, I think the question is do we specialize in the Weather Service going forward, right? Because right now everyone's kind of I've heard described as like middle infielder or whatever you want to call it, is like, you can do everything, right? You're expected to do everything, trained in everything, but is there tracks in the future, right? Is that something that weather service wants to do? I don't know if we've had that conversation, but yeah, it's hiring it's hiring more extroverts, and there's a track for that. I don't know.
Wendy?
It was a question off of it, so I'm glad you went next. But I came in late, so I don't know, was Nuicio discussed as part of the culture? That's part of our culture here, and I'm NBU, but I'm junior on the totem pole. But, you know, and I've only been here for 6 years, and when 6 years, and when I came in the door, I was like, wow, there's a lot of contention with this Nuicio outfit and management, right? And that's part of our culture. And it gets embedded in what I see from AFS sometimes is that people will play like, you know, mom and dad are arguing and they'll pick one. So, you know what I mean? That's part of the culture as well, to get over on a point that they want. They'll pick the parent that's going to give them the advice in the position that they want. I think that needs to be addressed somehow. It's kind of, it's one of these underlying things, and sort of like you have this low-level virus in the background, but you're otherwise functioning. You still need to, you know, address the issue.
We never really ever, we don't talk about that very much.
Yeah,
the Nuicio part. But
yeah, and that's a really good point. And in the WFO case, I could say how management union relationships are handled varies widely. And so it gets back to your point, John, that a part of the conversation on culture does have to go back to this, that it's a culture of cultures. And really, each office could be radically different culture. So we have these sort of consistent themes that come out,
right.
But really addressing the culture question has to be local. And I firmly believe that the management and the union and the employees have to all be stakeholders in defining what is our culture, where do we need to go, and where can we improve. It can't be top-down driven, it can't be union negotiated, it has to be a conversation that everybody is engaged in.
Right.
Even though ostensibly management has an oversized role in it, like if they're not going to be on board, then, you know, and that's a problem. So, so really there's a lot of work to do, but I'm glad that finally, you know, there is an official effort, and you guys got this as part of your portfolio, and, you know, having this conversation in different venues over and over again, you'll lose your voice, I'm sure, at some point, giving these talks, but this is really what needs to happen, for some of this stuff to take root, and absolutely now is the time. It's, you know, couldn't be a better time to start introducing these concepts or reintroducing these concepts,
right.
given the change in the mission.
And I agree with you. I mean, a lot of it is just awareness. I mean, that was from that culture team, one of the biggest successes we had was just improving awareness, because these people would go back to their office and talk to their peers, say, hey, there is something to this culture thing, right? And you just kind of spread the word that way. So, you know, again, that's why I'm appreciative of you inviting us here. And we'd like to do more of this, because then we can just, you know, reach more people.
And small things, I firmly believe, can make a big difference. So when you talk about just tweaking in the right direction, a low-level effort you don't need a huge
right.
budget to do some of this stuff. It's really I think part of this is examining, you know, the sorts of habits, rituals, the things that exist, and say, you know, why do we continue to do things like this? You know, often this does come to recognition, and how, you know, even with the awards and recognition system that we have, that we don't think is, you know, optimal, there are ways to improve even how we do those, right? I know cash awards and things like that, and I like your idea of on-the-spot swag awards. I think those are all great ideas that getting to the point that you can do without a lot of effort. So,
traditionally, we talked about this morning too. Like traditionally, the culture work that we do is there'd be a FEVS results, right? A FEVS survey, and then it'd be like the DAA gets together with the president of Nuicio, and they decide on doing 3 things that stall.
yeah.
Right. And that's like the big culture. So like doing the bottom up, we're trying different things now, which I think, again, may not have as big of a reach, but do have an impact. So,
yeah.
Right.
And again, John already mentioned this, but we are continuing to do the bottom up and even middle level grassroots culture work in the form of our NRAPs. And we have 2 NRAP teams we're looking to form. One that is open to anyone and one that is focused more on the manager level. So please keep that in mind. And
spread the word.
And there's this ongoing supervisory training, right? I don't know where it's held now these days, but it would seem that having a little module on this would be appropriate. I'm sure they have one on diversity and all these other things, but a culture, 30 minutes on culture, no, an hour.
We're trying to get Elise to go to at least a new hires course coming up soon to introduce a little small cultural component.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Any last from anyone? Again, I really appreciate, John, you putting this together. I think it's an excellent presentation, and I hope more people see it, at least for you, for now officially permanent employee taking on this huge problem. She's got an outsized role. People will be coming along later and say, oh, we got to fill Elise's shoes. Those are big shoes to fill one day after this is all fixed. So a reminder, if you want to, we'll be uploading this recording of this presentation up to the VLab Forum website, so you can share the recording with your friends. You can download the slides also from there if you want to just share the slides or both. A reminder, we've got VLab Forum sessions coming up on May 16th. Continuing in our social science kind of mode, we have Dr. Brenda Phillips from University of Massachusetts talking about context-aware weather warning systems. In June, we've got Frank Alzheimer talking about the Satellite Training and Operations Resources effort. And in July, the Extreme Precipitation Forecast Improvement Project, Diana Stovern, and I think that one has a social science aspect to it as well, as I recall.
Is that the one that was?
That was the one.
Because of weather?
Yeah, that was canceled because of weather. And so we've had a couple of cancellations, but we're back on track, and hope to see you in May, June, and July. And we will be in touch. So thanks, everyone.